بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم.
Alhamdulillah wassalatu wassalam ala rasulillah. All praise is due to Allah, and may his peace and blessings be on the last messenger of Allah. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. It's my pleasure to be here with you with Jinnah Institute to talk about the strong believer. So I'm going to go ahead and share my slides and then we'll get started, inshallah. So the topic of today's talk is the strong believer. And this is based on the hadiths of the strong believer from Sahih Muslim. This is hadith number 2664. And it begins with, the strong believer is better and more dear to Allah than the weak believer, and there is good in both. So we're going to cover this entire hadith later today. We're going to go through it step by step. But I want to share with you first just some general thoughts about what it means to be a strong believer versus a weak believer. So the first thing I want to say is that it is okay if you're here in this talk and you're listening to this and you're thinking, well, I don't see myself as a strong believer right now. So if that's where you feel like you're at, I don't want you to feel any sort of pressure, like, well, I have to, make this transition, or I'm not a good Muslim if I'm in this place. I want to just put those thoughts to rest for you, and to just say that this is, if that's where you find yourself right now, be easy on yourself, and just know that becoming a strong believer is for those who want to level up. So I invite you to just simply sit back and listen and see how this resonates with you, without any pressure, without any should this and should that, and I shouldn't be like this or I shouldn't be like that. Just kind of take it, just walk this journey with me and see how it, what it means to you. So first I want to start with just some general thoughts about what does it mean to be weak or strong from an Islamic perspective. So that's where we're going to get started first. And I want to share with you some thoughts from Yasmin Mujahid from her book, Reclaim Your Heart, where she talks about this. So what she says there is that every time you run after, seek, or petition something weak or feeble, which by definition is everything other than Allah, you too become weak or feeble. So you can see here that the weakness or the strength that we have comes from what we attach ourselves to. And as she says here, anything that you attach to other than Allah is weak by definition. Examples of attaching to things, aspects of dunya, are like attaching to things. So that's what we would call materialism. So for example, being attached to wealth or position or possessions or fame, anything like that shows a material attachment to dunya. But there's also another type of attachment, and that is codependency, where we're attached to people. We need to please people. We need to have their approval. We cannot bear the thought of someone disagreeing with us or somebody not liking us. Another aspect of this is where we feel like we have to fix other people's problems before we can be okay. So this is not like from a place of generosity, but it's more like, I can't be okay until you're different. And what was really eye-opening for me in her book when I reread it recently, actually in the process of rereading it now, is that she says right in the beginning that she never thought of herself as someone who was attached to dunya because she wasn't attached to things. But as she realized through her own spiritual journey, was that her attachment was to people. And so this is another way that, shaitan can sort of deceive us and weaken us, is when we make other people the object of our happiness instead of Allah. So now let's look at the reverse of that. What is it that makes us strong from an Islamic perspective? She says it beautifully again in the book, where she says, when what you hold on to is strong, you too become strong. So strength for us is not something that you inherently are and others inherently are not. It's not something that is only available to certain people. And it's not a direct result of any qualities that you may have developed in yourself. It really goes back to, what are you holding on to? Where is your dependence? If your dependence on something is on something that is strong, then you will be strong. And if it is on something weak, then you will be weak. And by definition, anything that you could try to grasp onto other than Allah is weak. And the ayah that she shares, in order to make this point, is from Surah Baqarah. And this is ayah number 256, where it says, there shall be no compulsion in acceptance of religion. The right course has become distinct from the wrong. So whoever disbelieves in Taghut, which is false objects of worship, any false object of worship, whoever disbelieves in that and believes in Allah has grasped the most trustworthy handhold with no break in it. And Allah is hearing and knowing. So when we leave our attachment to dunya, things or people, any aspect of dunya, and instead we are attached, connected, dependent on Allah, that is what gives us the inner strength. And that is what we are talking about here with the hadith of the strong believer. So just, general, sort of a side-by-side comparison, if you will. As we said at the top, it's okay to be a weak believer. A weak believer is someone who believes in Allah, is fulfilling the minimum requirements of the deen. The difference, though, between the weak believer and the strong believer in that aspect is that the strong believer is also doing that, but they have a very deep connection to Allah as well. So it's not just a surface level, I'm taking care of the basics and I'm good. It's much deeper than that. The next contrast that we have is that the weak believer is someone who is depending on their own self, their own strength. They're sort of deluded by their ability. They believe they have more ability than they do, or they believe they should have more ability than they do. Whereas the strong believer, ironically, is comfortable with their weakness. They are not deluded into thinking that they are stronger than they really are. They actually know that they are nothing and that there is no might nor power except with Allah. And they have made peace with that. They're comfortable with that. And I think that's really ironic, right? To think that the weak believer is the one who's attached to their own strength, and the strong believer is actually the one who is okay with their own weakness. The next contrast goes back to the idea of the attachment, where the weak believer is someone who, though they're not, physically like bowing before an idol or worshiping, other gods in an overt sense like that, where they're committing like major shirk, but there's some minor shirk there because they're grasping at dunya, they're attached to dunya. And when our heart is attached to something, though it wouldn't be fair to say that is, like a major shirk, but it's still a minor shirk in the sense that we are giving some power to other than Allah. When we're attached to money, when we're attached to possessions, when we're dependent on other people for our happiness, that is a sort of grasping at dunya. That's what we're talking about here. Whereas the strong believer, now I want to really drive home this point because this is really important. We often think that someone who is strong in their faith is someone who doesn't care about dunya, or who rejects dunya, who turns away from it, and they just spend all of their time worshiping Allah. But that is not the description of a strong believer. That is not our understanding in Islam. Other faith traditions do have that concept of, those who are the most pious are the ones who reject the world. They turn away from the world. They silence all of their, bodily needs and that sort of thing. But for us, we are in the dunya, we interact with the dunya, but we're not clinging to it. We're able to hold it loosely in our hands. The way she says, the way that Yasmin Mujahid says it in her book is she says that we hold the dunya in our hands and not in our heart. And I think that's really beautiful. She also gives the example of a ship sailing through the ocean. And she says that the ship is like our heart and the ocean is like the dunya. So the ocean, the dunya, it serves a purpose. As we cross through the dunya, the deeds we do are what are going to take us to paradise, inshallah. May Allah grant us all that end and may we all meet in Jannah. So we cannot dismiss the dunya, right? We're going to cross through it. Allah has put us here. We're going to cross through it. But what we want is we want to keep the water of the ocean outside of our boat. We want to travel over it and not get so in love with it that we bring the water into the boat. And when we say it that way, we think, well, why would anyone do that, right? Because when you're thinking about being on the ocean, you would never do that. But ironically, that's what often how we interact with the dunya is like we love it so much we just bring it into our hearts. So the strong believer is able to maintain this balance of being in the dunya, interacting with it, using it for what it is meant for, which is to get us to Allah, but doesn't let the waters of the dunya get into their heart. So I thought that was a really beautiful analogy of looking at this, how to look at the difference between the weak believer and the strong believer. And then the last one that I have here is, and there's many more that you could say, but this is just kind of to give you a general idea so you can see this contrast, is that the weak believer often feels disoriented, whereas the strong believer is focused and stable. Now, why is that? Where is this feeling of disorientation coming from? This feeling is coming from the fact that the weak believer is scattered. It goes back to the previous one of grasping at dunya. When you're grasping at multiple things, which is what you do by definition when you're not holding on to just one thing, is that you're scattered. And when you're scattered, that makes you disoriented. You're being pulled in this direction and that direction. Whereas the strong believer, though they are interacting with all these dunya things, but their heart is only attached in one place, just in one place. And that gives them the focus and the stability. Another way of thinking about this contrast is that the weak believer is someone who is confused about themselves, their purpose, the nature of this dunya, the nature of Allah. Again, they're still a believer, so they're doing the basic obligations and staying away from the major prohibitions, but they are not very... they're a little bit deluded about what their role is in this life, what is the nature of this life, and the nature of Allah. So by contrast, the strong believer is clear about each of those things. The strong believer, she knows who she is, what her ability is and isn't. She's very clear about her purpose. She knows that she has a singular purpose, and that is to worship Allah, to please Allah. And anything in this dunya, anything about her life that takes her closer to that is what she is going to focus on. And any aspect of her life that is going to take her away from that is something she's going to always be on guard for. She's always going to be cautious of that. It doesn't mean that the strong believer is always on point and always on purpose, but they have a sort of a radar where they're always looking and checking, whereas the weak believer is kind of scattered and isn't really aware when they're on track and when they're off track. Because we're all human beings, right? So we're all going to get off track from time to time. But the strong believer is a little bit more sensitive. They can tell more when they've done that, when they've gotten off track. And then they can, they know what to do to bring themselves back on track, whether that's dua, whether that's, just increasing in their fasting, whether that's connecting with the Quran more, whether that's just sitting and contemplating about Allah and their own condition. There's lots of, different tools that we have in our faith. But this is something that is a priority for them. This is something that is very important for them, more important than really anything else. And then the nature of this dunya. So this is another thing that, Yasmin Mujahid talks a lot about in her book, is that for the weak believer, this dunya is supposed to be fair. It's supposed to have everything in it. It's supposed to be perfect. And so because they're deluded about the nature of this dunya, when something bad happens, they become quite distressed. Whereas the strong believer knows that, yes, perfection exists. Yes, perfect peace exists, but not here. So they're able to be patient, and they're also able to not get too distressed when people or things in this life aren't the way they want them to be. In fact, not only do they not get distressed, but as you progress more and more, because these two things are not finite states, they're more along a continuum, right? You can be, there's a whole continuum between each of these. And you could be at any point along that range at any given time in your life. So as you progress further on this road of becoming the strong believer, not only are you not distressed, but you almost come to expect that, when a problem happens, it's like, okay, there's another one. Not in a sense of being cynical, but in a sense of not being shaken by it. And this idea of not being shaken is something that's going to come up in the hadith of the strong believer, which I'll share with you in a little bit. And the nature of Allah. The strong believer is clear about the nature of Allah. The strong believer knows Allah. The strong believer is someone who has studied the names of Allah and often reflects on them. Whereas the weak believer, they know Allah exists, they believe in Allah, they worship Allah, but they don't really have that deep understanding of Allah. And until we know Allah, we cannot love Allah. And until we know and love Allah, we cannot obey Him and trust Him in the way that we are really meant to. So for the strong believer, knowing their Lord is something that is very important to them. And that knowledge is always deepening. So it's not something that the strong believer would do once and just be done with. From my own experience, I can tell you that I've taken so many different courses on the names of Allah with so many different teachers, so many different places. And just recently, I was going through some, I was learning about the names of Allah through a different place. This is through Back to the Fitra Mentoring Academy with my coach, Catherine Jones, who's an Australian convert. And so in the Back to the Fitra Academy, one of the things she teaches about is the names of Allah. And four of the names, so two pairs of names basically that we learned about in there. Al-Qabid, Al-Basit, the constrictor, the expander, and then Al-Khafid, Al-Rafi. So Al-Khafid is the lower or the debaser, and Al-Rafi is the exalter or the honor. Now, a lot of times when people think of names like Al-Khafid or Al-Qabid, the lower or the constrictor, we think of, and someone said this in the class, or the teacher shared that someone had said this to her previously, so when she said that she was teaching a class on the names of Allah, they asked her, so do you teach the bad names too? SubhanAllah, like Allah is exalted above that, right? But indirectly, I think we do sometimes think like, oh, I want to study Ar-Rahman, Ar-Rahim, but I don't want to study Al-Qabid and Al-Khafid, right? Because that's just for evil people. He debases evil people. He constricts the provision of evil people. I'm not that, so I don't want to study that. I don't want to get depressed and think about that aspect of Allah. And subhanAllah, in this class, the way that she explained those names, it just made me see Allah in a whole different light. And so what she said was that Al-Khafid, the one who lowers, he does that in order to soften our hearts. He does that in order to bring us closer to him. It's not a humiliation. It's something that he does to help us. Even that is from his mercy, to soften our hearts, to help us relax a little bit, to not try so hard. And similarly with al-qabid, the constrictor, that's also not, quote unquote, a bad name. When Allah constricts something from us, he's limiting something from us that is not good for us anyway. So this is the idea of like, so there's different ways that Allah constricts things from us. One is the halal and haram, right? So things that are haram, that's a sort of a constriction, isn't it? But there's mercy in that, because Allah only prohibits that which is bad for us and only makes obligatory that which we need. So there's a mercy in it, right? It's not something we need to run from or feel bad about. Similarly, the al-qabit is the one who may restrict us from getting certain things that we want in this life. But that, again, is not to be seen as a humiliation or a negative thing. He does that, again, to help us to turn our attention away from that which is weak and to turn it to that which is strong. And I know I keep bringing up the book, Reclaim Your Heart, but because I'm reading it right now, all these examples are just coming to my mind. She talks about when you're in a storm, when you're in a difficulty in your life, have you ever noticed how it seems like every door you go to is closed? You know, even doors that before you could rely on, meaning like either people or resources or whatever. And so you're running from this door to that door, and it just seems like nothing is available. No one is there for you. And she says that that's actually, of course, everything Allah does is there's wisdom in it. But if we really pay attention here, the fact that Allah closes all the other doors when we're in a storm is so that we only can pick the right answer. It's like what she describes it as being given a test, a multiple choice test, and then there's only one answer in the choices, and it's the right answer. Imagine that. Like, imagine being given a test and you can't pick the wrong answer because it's not even one of the choices. So, it reminds us that even when he restricts something from us, that there's only good in that. He's doing that to focus our attention back to him, because we have gotten scattered in some way. We are fearing people, we are clinging to things, and he's saying, no, that's not where it's at. You need to come back to me. And so I thought that was just really beautiful. So again, knowing the nature of Allah, studying the nature of Allah, and really never stopping doing that, because like I said, every time I've taken a class on the names of Allah with a different teacher, I gain a new level of appreciation that I did not have before. And this is something that for the strong believer is very important to them. So it's not just enough for them to know the basic do's and don'ts. Like, okay, just tell me what I need to do. Tell me what I'm not supposed to do. I'll do my best to fulfill what I'm, required to, and I'll do my best to stay away from the haram. And just other than that, just leave me alone and let me focus on my life. That's kind of how the weak believer is approaching their deen. Whereas for the strong believer, it's something much, much deeper. It's not just a set of rules. It's not just a set of do's and don'ts. It's something that they live in their hearts. And so that's, these are just some ways that we can make this contrast and we can understand the difference between the weak believer and the strong believer. So I don't know if there's any way for me to take questions, or I don't have the YouTube page open where I could see, if anyone has any questions or comments, but I really would love to. Okay, good. So we've got some coming up on the screen, because I really want to make sure that we are clear on this concept of weak versus strong before we keep going. So MR said, Assalamu alaikum, wa alaikum assalam. Can you share knowledge about people pleasing and closed-mindedness? Yes, I would love to. So this is actually something that I'm kind of learning myself right now, is that I'll give you an example. So, and closed-mindedness is different. So let me take each of these one by one, because I think a lot of us, we struggle with both of these. People pleasing, an example of this is when we make the approval of others a criteria for how we're going to behave. And sometimes this is so subtle. It is so subtle. And it's one of the ways that shaitan deceives us. You know, when shaitan can't come in the front door of our hearts, he tries to come in the back door. Everyone has a back door, everyone. And one of the ways that he'll do that, so if he can't openly get you to just like leave your faith or stop praying or anything like that, he'll try more subtle things. And it could be something like, oh, well, you know, if you say that, you know, that person might get upset, or that person might not like it. Okay, but is that the number one question that we should be asking as Muslims? Our number one question is, what is pleasing to Allah? And that is sometimes going to mean saying or doing things that other people won't agree with. So the pleasure, it's people pleasing is basically, from an Islamic definition of that, could be that when the pleasure of people is more important to us than the pleasure of Allah. That's when it's a problem. So when it's simply a matter of, you know, I'm a nice person and I like to make people happy and I like to do things for people, that's wonderful. Those are all things that are encouraged in our deen. But it's when we make the pleasure of other people a condition, or when we make it more important than the pleasure of Allah, then that's when we have to be mindful of it. Closed-mindedness, the second one that you asked about, could take many, many forms. This is really, I think, an easy way to sort of describe this is that are we willing to look at something from different perspectives, or are we certain that the way that we have understood it is the only way? And so this kind of, it goes back to the name of al-khafid, the one who lowers, because sometimes we may find that we're kind of hitting a brick wall. And so this could be Allah is telling us, wait, maybe you need to back up and look at this differently, right? So it's like it's a humbling reminder that we don't have the full picture. And my coach, Catherine Jones, when she teaches about the inside out paradigm, like how our mind actually works. And one of the things she says is that every individual, every human being lives in their own separate reality. So it is never possible for two people to see the world in exactly the same way. And when we know this, and when we come into our interactions with people with this expectation that people are not going to see things exactly the way I see them, then it helps us not to be closed-minded. And it helps us to not be so offended when, you know, someone sees something differently. It helps us to not be so shocked. It helps us to not be so, to take it personally, right? Because that's when we know it's a problem, is when we start to take opinions of other people personally. And this is related to people pleasing. Now, what I do also want to say about this, because I like to kind of, like I said before, people pleasing, if you're just being nice to someone, that's a good thing. So with this, sometimes, unfortunately, in our day and age where our values as Muslims are very different than mainstream values that we're surrounded by, people might accuse you, for example, if you say that you're against, you know, such and such social thing that's, you know, going on around you, people might say, oh, well, you're closed-minded. You should be accepting of those people that have different lifestyle choices and this and that. And the thing is that it's not about judging people, but we do, the action itself, we do take the position that we love what Allah loves and we hate what Allah hates. So that is not being closed-minded in a negative sense. That's actually being consistent. That's actually being whole, in that you are dedicated to your faith, that you are not picking and choosing and scattering yourself and saying, well, I like this aspect of Islam, but I don't agree with that aspect. So that's not closed-mindedness. And I hope that, you know, if you're feeling that from those around you in any way, that you're able to resist that and say, no, actually, I don't see this as being closed-minded. I see this as being true to my faith. I see this as being true to what Allah and his messenger, sallallahu alaihi wasallam, teach. And if there are times when others don't agree with that, your job is to put the pleasure of Allah above that. That doesn't mean that, you must, that other people must agree with you, because they may not. Again, people live in separate realities, but it's important for you to be clear about where you stand. So I love that question. And I hope that answer was helpful, not only to the person who asked, but for all those who are listening. Another question from Najwa is how to become a strong believer. So I'm so happy that you asked that, and we are going to talk about that today. Exactly answering that question. So let's actually continue at this point and look at the hadith of the strong believer. So that's what I want to share with you next. Is what has the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam told us about being the strong believer. So what we're going to actually do is I'm actually going to take this hadith piece by piece and answer your question. So the first part of it is what we said before. The strong believer is better and more dear to Allah than the weak believer, and there is good in both. So as long as you're a believer, alhamdulillah, right? As long as you are on the path of the deen, alhamdulillah. But if you are now ready to level up and say, I want to do more than the minimum, I want to be that which is better and more dear to Allah, then let's see what this hadith is telling us about that. So the first thing, so there's 4 things here in this hadith. The first one is, these are the 4 things that the strong believer does. The strong believer is vigilant for what is to your benefit. Be vigilant for what is to your benefit. So you are someone, as a strong believer, who is aware of what your needs are, and you are looking after your needs. You're not denying or rejecting your needs. And I'll get into more detail as we go through, but I want to first share the 4 points with you first. The next one, seek the help of Allah. We've talked about this in the beginning, and that's why I wanted to give you a overview first. The strong believer is different in that they place their trust only in Allah. It's not divided, because even the weak believer believes in Allah, right? We've said that. But the strong believer, they are not dividing up their seeking of help into different places where, yes, I believe in Allah, of course, but then I'm also depending on this person and that thing and that thing. The strong believer is one who more and more of their dependence is going to just the one source, the source of all things, the source of everything good. The next one, do not falter. Do not become shaky. You and I, we become shaky when we are affected by tests. So our iman, it's like when it's on the edge, and as long as things are good, we're happy, we believe in Allah, we have that good connection. But then as soon as we're tested, we kind of like, why did Allah do this to me? Why is this happening to me? So the strong believer is one who does not falter. The other thing that we do not falter in is our desires. So even if you're not in a test, your desires are something that can pull you away from that steadfastness, where you see something you want or someone you want, and even though you know it's not pleasing to Allah, you are unable to stay steady on the straight path, and you get pulled this way and that by your desires. So the strong believer is someone who does not falter. And again, this is on a continuum, right? So they are more leaning on the side of not faltering than faltering. It doesn't mean they never do, but these are some of the general qualities of someone who is a strong believer, that they are able to stay steady when they are tested, or when they're tested with a trial, or when they're tested with their own desires. So that's number 3. The next one is something that, I mean, I find myself reflecting on this all the time. And this one helps me so much when I get down about something. I always remember this part, and it always makes me feel better. So when you are stricken by some setback, do not say, if only I had done such and such. Rather say, is the decree of Allah, and He does whatever He wills. Oftentimes, when we find ourselves in a problem, one of the first things Shaitan does to us, and I'll go ahead and share the next part because it's tied to this. For verily the saying if, as in if only I had, begins the work of the devil. So this is from Shaitan. So let's go back to this now. The fourth thing that the strong believer does. When the strong believer is stricken by a setback, they don't try to go back and change the past. They don't launch into self-loathing and self-blaming. This, to me, it just gives me so much hope. We often think that if we go back and we dig up all our mistakes and we show, how horrible we feel that I did this or I did that, that's what Allah wants from us. That is not what Allah wants from you. That is not what He wants. This is different from like having remorse and making amends. This is more like just self-loathing, like just sitting there and thinking, I shouldn't have done that, or if only I had done that. Allah wants us, when something is in the past, to simply say, it is the decree of Allah and He does whatever He wills. Now, I get a lot of questions about this part of the hadith whenever I teach it, because people will often say, but aren't we supposed to do our part? Aren't we supposed to do what we can? Because our deen doesn't teach us to be passive. And that's exactly right. But so is this. So let me show you how the two reconcile. When we are looking at something in the past, something that is already done, we are not to hate on ourselves for choices that we made. We are instead supposed to say that this could not have happened from my wanting or doing something. This was only from the decree of Allah. Otherwise, it couldn't have happened. Everything that happens is only from His permission. Not that Allah wants bad things to happen, but it is part of His wisdom. It's part of His plan. And it was part of His decree. Now we contrast that with things that have not yet happened. So if there's something that you are dealing with right now in the present moment, a choice that you need to make, or something that could happen later, the truth of the matter is that we don't know what is decreed. We do not have knowledge of the unseen. So our job in that case is to do the best we can, not to sit back and say, well, whatever's meant to be will be. No. For something that's in our control, our job is to find out what it is we can do. Now, you may be in a situation right now where there's things that are outside of your control. The outcome of it hasn't happened yet, but it's something that you can't do anything about. In that case, yes, even then you release it to Allah. You let go. You lighten yourself from that burden of trying to control it. But absolutely anything that you still have control over, meaning that it's not already in the past, it's right here in front of you, absolutely you want to do what you can. This is talking about the self-loathing and the self-hate that we engage in when we find ourselves in a difficulty, and instead of acting in a constructive way from where we're standing right now in this present moment, we're trying to redo the past. Because when you're saying, if only I had done such and such, essentially what you're doing is you're trying to change the past, if only in your mind, right? If only in your mind, but you're trying to make it turn out differently, and you're trying to go through what you could have done. And this is only from Shaitan that we have these thoughts. These are not helpful or constructive thoughts that we have. So, and once we start to adopt this quality, this is one of the ways that we can become stronger as a believer. And the opposite of this, when we do say, if only I had done this, if only I had done that, that's when we stay stuck in being a weak believer. So I just find so much mercy in this, right? I find so much hope. Every time I think about this, it brings me back to the present moment. Really, I mean, if you look at so much of what self-help and personal growth teaches us, is it's about coming back to the present moment, not drifting into the past or trying to predict the future. And in that sense, that's something that, we that's something in harmony with what our deen teaches us. It teaches us not to dwell on the past, and also not to pretend that we have knowledge of the unseen, which we don't. Anything that hasn't happened yet, we don't know how it's going to turn out. So churning that over in our minds and trying to forecast is of no benefit, right? And then, so we covered this. So the saying, if only, that begins the work of the devil. So if we want to sort of summarize these 4 things that we are learning in this hadith of how do we be the strong believer in a general sense, what we're learning here is that the strong believer is someone who, instead of denying our interests, we guard them. Instead of relying on ourselves, we rely on Allah. The first one, that was be vigilant for what is to your benefit. The second one was seek the help of Allah. The third one was do not falter. So that's, instead of being shaken, we remain steadfast. That's what we're learning there, is that the strong believer is someone who is able to remain steadfast. And then finally, instead of saying if only, we say it is the decree of Allah and He does whatever He wills. Qadar Allahi wa ma sha'a fa'al. So instead of blaming ourselves, we accept Allah's decree. So now what I want to share with you is, what are some examples? Because this might sound kind of like sort of high level, right? And a little bit like theoretical. So if we want to really drill down to this and say, well, what would that look like in my life if I could achieve that, if I could be that? And so these are some things that you would notice. You would be able to handle problems more gracefully. You would be able to speak up without fear of others, because again, you're putting the pleasure of Allah first. You'd be able to let go of overwhelm and self-doubt, because you're not always blaming yourself and thinking, oh, if only this or that. You're putting all your trust in Allah. You're putting it all in one place. It's not on yourself. It's not on other people. It's just on Him. And the last 2 in particular, I think they really give you, I think it will really help you picture the difference of being a weak believer versus a strong believer. When you are a strong believer, this is really important. It's not just that you handle your problems gracefully, or that you're able to speak up, or you're not full of doubt, but that you are able to flourish because you're looking after your needs. The weak believer might be someone who is really a good person. They're trying their best to obey Allah. They're doing, the basics of what they have to do. But it's often someone who they're just not putting their needs. They're not making it a priority to take care of themselves. They're not guarding their own interests. And so that's what makes them weak. And another way of looking at that is that when you do look after yourself, when your cup is full, you have more to give. So the weak believer might be a giver, might be someone who is very loving and caring and wants to do for other people, but they're doing it from a depleted place. They're feeling depleted inside. They do it anyway because they know that it's pleasing to Allah. But the strong believer is able to give from a place of abundance, because their needs are being met. So their cup is overflowing. And so giving comes more easily. It is not something that takes away from them. And really key here also is that they don't end up with resentment. Someone who is a weak believer, who is giving from that place of lack inside, is, even though the deeds that they're doing are good and they're helping people, and that's wonderful, and they're getting rewarded for that, but inside there's some resentment that's building. And at some point that comes out somehow. It might come out in just the ways that you sort of like grit your teeth, and you're like reminding people of what you've done for them, or you're talking to other people about what you've done for certain others. Or if you keep that in as well and you don't even let that come out, then it's just, there's this explosion, where all that resentment just comes pouring out. And don't think that if you're a patient person that could never happen to you. Like, it can happen. So don't deny your needs. Don't put the pleasure of other people before the pleasure of Allah, because that will weaken you. That will weaken your faith. That will weaken your ability to be the best version of yourself. And the strong believer is someone who is very much interested, not only in being connected to Allah and fulfilling their obligations and so on, but they want to live the best version of their life that they can. So they're really thinking much more big. Their thinking is much broader. It's much more hopeful. They really understand the vastness of Allah's generosity. Allah's Al-Kareem. He's the most generous. So the strong believer doesn't hold back in what they ask of Allah. They say, "Oh Allah, I want the best in the next life. I want to be saved from the hellfire, but I also want good in this life," right? The dua that Allah teaches us in Surah Baqarah, ayah number 201, "Rabbana atina fid dunya hasana wa fil akhirati hasana wa qina adhaban nar." Like, when the strong believer reads that, they really believe it. It's not just a pie in the sky thing for them. It's something that, because Allah has told them to ask for this thing, Allah has put this dua in the Quran, they know that it must be possible, that there is a way to have good in this life, good in the next, and to be safe from the hellfire. May Allah make all of us safe from the hellfire, and may He grant all of us good in this life and in the next. Please join me in saying Ameen. So now, as you're hearing all of this, you might be thinking, and one of the sisters asked earlier, is how do I actually do this? My purpose today is, it was to give you a good, clear picture of what the end result looks like. And I hope that I was able to do that in terms of you knowing what is the difference between a weak believer and a strong believer. We talked about weakness and strength from an Islamic perspective. Weakness is when you're attaching to what is weak, and strength is when you attach to what is strong. Jazakallah khair for posting that. I really appreciate you putting the dua there from Surah Baqarah, ayah number 201. And so now you may be saying, well, at the beginning, I was kind of thinking, strong believer, yeah, I don't know, I'm a little bit intimidated thinking about that. What does that entail? What is that about? And maybe now you're saying, well, yeah, that's something I want. That's something that I would like to strive for. And so if that's what you are, if that's where you're at this point, then I want to offer you a program, a course that I've developed, which gives you a step-by-step method that works in today's world. So it's very practical. It's made for sisters, for women just like you, who want to elevate their iman and at the same time live their best life. They want to be the strong believer. And so if that's where you're at, and if that's what you're striving for, then I'd love for you to join me for my upcoming course called, of course, The Strong Believer, which starts on February 12th. And so what I'd like to do is just tell you a little bit about that, if that's okay. And then I would love to take any questions from you. And yes, so JannahInstitute.org. In fact, I think it's JannahInstitute.com, right? Or maybe you can go to either one. And you can learn more about that. So I'd like to just share just a little bit about what the course is all about. So The course is built around my signature system, which I call the 5 C's of personal growth for Muslims. This is the step-by-step methodology that I've developed that gives Muslim women today the knowledge and the tools and the mindset and the skills that they need in order to thrive, both in deen and dunya. So I spent the last several years putting this together, and I've taught this program a number of times to small groups of women. This is the first time that it's being offered to, a worldwide audience, and I'm so grateful to Jannah Institute for inviting me to share this program with you. I did a previous talk for Jannah Institute where I went into detail on each of the 5 C's. That was on December 7th, so you're welcome to find that on the YouTube page or the Facebook page if you want to learn more about this system. But what I just want to share with you briefly here today is that the 5 C's are, they cover both the inner and the outer aspects of personal growth for us as Muslim women. So the first 2 C's are related to your inner growth. These are things like your level of iman, your connection to Allah, as well as how we think and feel. So managing your emotions, gaining that emotional mastery. That's what the first 2 C's are about. And then the last 3 C's are about the outer aspects of your personal growth. So these are things like how we organize our time and how we interact with others, how we show up in the world. This is unique because a lot of personal growth programs, they focus on one or the other. So those that focus on the inner aspect, they'll give you all of the mindset, the spiritual connectivity to Allah. They'll help you boost your iman. But then there's no tools for how do you go out in the world and live differently now that you have that. And then there's other programs that focus purely on the outer aspects. So they'll teach you, things like time management or communication skills, but there's no foundation of the deep connection with Allah or the emotional mastery. So without that foundation, there's only so much benefit you can get from learning the strategies. So this program is unique in that it combines both of those into one system. In this course, you will receive, you will develop your own personal growth plan, which is something that I will guide you through week by week through journaling activities. So you'll do a bunch of reflection and journaling that I'll guide you through during the program. And you'll also leave with your own life balance wheel, where you'll be looking at 6 key areas of your life as a Muslim woman today, where you're at and where you'd like to be. And so I'll be helping you with that as well. So this is, as you can see, it's really practical. And again, I think the most unique thing about it is that it's made specifically for Muslim women. And so what I'd like to do now is share with you some of what others have said, those who have been through the program before. This course is a life-changing experience. I encourage you all to join this workshop. It's not like any other course I've taken. Sister Aisha coaches you step by step, teaching you skills that will help you on your personal growth journey. What I love the most is that the fabric of our spiritual growth is intertwined with every process and step. I've learned how to communicate better, how to stop the self-doubt, change the mindset, and I pray that I continue down this path of positivity and excel. Sister Sada said, Sister Aisha's class has been such a life-changing experience for me. She beautifully taught me how to organize ourselves physically and spiritually through Islam so that we can be the most productive version of ourselves. I feel much lighter and forgiving towards myself after Sister Aisha reminded us how forgiving and loving Allah is towards us. She's taught me how to be more confident of myself as a Muslim woman in America, alhamdulillah. I highly recommend this class to everyone. A sister in Michigan said, I have been struggling with the fact that I wanted to go and do something for myself. I was looking for a life coach because I was making some transitions. Once being a career woman, then being at home, and now starting to go out there. But I just didn't want anybody who was just a regular life coach because there's so many out there. I wanted someone also who understood my background and my faith, especially the communication portions with the non-Muslims and with Muslims. because I have been asked a lot of questions by non-Muslims, and to develop all that, because when you're going out in the world, you want your identity to be solid. A working mom of 5 who had just lost her husband about a year before, this is what she said at the end of the program. I was going through a lot of things in my life. It was like a normal life to a new normal. Even the kids, to make their lives more normal, I had to first find myself and organize myself. I was in a lot of turmoil and I didn't know which direction, how to get my life together. And all the C's and everything else taught me a lot of things. First of all, to take care of myself and start off from there, and then organizing everything else. Previously, before coming into this program, I was like, where do I start? So now I have the tools and a platform. I know the direction to move forward and the way to do it. Every big wave starts with a little ripple. So I would consider this like a little ripple. And I think this was a very important step. Sister Hiba said, I am grateful that I took this opportunity and made time to work on myself. Life is always busy and there's always something going on. Opportunities like this come once in a lifetime, and through investing and dedicating time in my personal growth, I have not only met amazing, talented women, been mentored by an amazing teacher and mentor, but I have gained the tools I need to be a successful member of society, a better Muslim, and a better version of myself. A sister who is married and is a college counselor in the DC area said, it was about personal growth and seeing it from an Islamic lens. Oftentimes, when you think about individuals evolving or having self-help approaches or tactics, it's usually not combined. The psychology behind this is usually not paired up from an Islamic lens. So that's the course. Again, it's called The Strong Believer. You can learn more at JannahInstitute.com. We begin, inshallah, on February 12th. And with that, I'd like to close. I'd like to thank you for being here. Jazakallah khair to Jannah Institute for having me and hosting me today. And if there are any questions about anything that I covered, please feel free to ask. So someone asked, what are the key points to differentiate confidence from arrogance? And how do we avoid arrogance? That's a really excellent question, because anytime when we talk about confidence from an Islamic perspective, it is it's unique from what we may learn in other paradigms, right? So arrogance is when we our self-image of us causes us to hurt other people. It causes us to put other people down. It causes us to be unjust. Whereas healthy confidence is when we are able to shine and be the best version of ourselves, thereby feeling good on the inside, but also doing what's pleasing to Allah. So it's a win-win. Confidence from an Islamic perspective is a win-win, whereas arrogance is not. That's not what we're after at all. And I really appreciate you asking this, because a lot of times we fear, I don't know if fear is the best word, but we're a little bit nervous about being confident. We think that it's dangerous. We think that if I'm a good Muslim, I should always sort of put myself down in a way. And in Islam, there's two concepts. There's modesty, which is good, and then there's blameworthy modesty. So just think about that for a moment, that the fact that there is certain types of humility that is actually not what Allah wants from us. I'll give you 2 examples of modesty that is not pleasing to Allah. One is when we are so humble that we don't ask questions about our deen. This is one of the things that Aisha radiallahu anha praised about the women of the Ansar, that their shyness never prevented them from asking questions to deepen their knowledge of the deen. So they were confident, right? That takes confidence to step up and ask awkward or difficult questions in order to learn your deen better. The other one, which is really, really important, is when we think that in our dealings with people who are critical of our faith, whether they are fellow Muslims or non-Muslims, that we should always lower ourselves. We should always be humble. And that is not true. When we are dealing with those who are critical of our faith, it's important for us to have izzah. Izzah, that may be a word that helps you understand the concept of confidence from an Islamic perspective, that we should not hang our heads low. In fact, we should keep our heads up. Not in the sense of trying to harm anybody, but being full of confidence in what we are following, which is the deen of Allah. So again, there's when it gets into I hope that helps you see the difference, right? So confidence is win-win, whereas arrogance is not good for us. Really, it's not even good for us in this life, but it's certainly not good for us in the next life. So thank you so much for that question. Does anybody else have any things they want to ask? So Infinite Light, I love that name, asks, Assalamu alaikum, wa alaikum assalam. Could you please recommend a few resources for learning more in depth about the names of Allah? Books, webinars, etc. Yeah, so I will mention a couple to you. So one course that I took recently, a few years ago, was through Al-Maghrib, and this was taught by Sheikh Amar Al-Shukri, and it's called His Majesty, Unlocking the Names of Allah. And that is a beautiful, beautiful course. So His Majesty through Al-Maghrib is a beautiful course for you to learn about the names of Allah. The Back to the Fitra Mentoring Academy through Catherine Jones is about spiritual and emotional resilience. So it covers a lot of things, but when you join the inner circle, one of the topics that are covered is the names of Allah. And those are the examples that I shared with you. And then there's actually a book that I have. I'm going to pull it from my bookshelf and share that with you really quick. So if you want just a really simple place to start and you're not necessarily looking to like sign up for a course or a coaching program or anything, this book is a wonderful wonderful starting point, and it's called The Most Beautiful Names of Allah, and it's by Samira Fayyad Khawalde. What I love about this book is that it is very simple, and it doesn't get into some of the bid'ah aspects that I have seen in books sometimes when talking about the names of Allah. Specifically, and I want to tell you exactly what I mean here, is that we believe our mainstream understanding of Allah and our connection to Allah is that Allah's knowledge encompasses all things, but Allah is not physically present in everything and everywhere. Whereas there are some schools of thought that get into this notion of Allah is inside of me, or Allah is everywhere. And so we want to stay away from that. So when we're studying the names of Allah, we want to be sure that we're studying it from a reliable place. And so this book is free of that. That's one thing that I like about it. And again, it's just really simple, really beautiful way to begin your journey. So thank you so much for that question. I hope those recommendations were helpful to you and to everyone here. I know that we are just a touch over our time. So if there are no more questions or comments, I will go ahead. There's one more, so I'll address that one and then we'll close after that, inshallah. So Zinat said, if companies behave rude. So I'll answer that in a general sense. It could be a company, it could be a person. What do you do? I guess your question is, I'm making an assumption here, and if I'm not correct, then please do clarify for me. But it sounds like what you're saying is, if someone is rude to you, then what's the right way to respond? Is that what you're asking? It can be difficult when people kind of push our buttons. You know, when we're in a emotionally charged situation, whether that's a company or an individual or any circumstance. And we want to do our very best to stand up for ourselves and stand up for what is just, and stand up for those we love without, compromising the boundaries for respectful behavior. And when we first learn how to speak up, when we first step out of I'm just going to never say anything. And when we first step into, okay, I think that being quiet all the time is not very just. It's actually oppressive. So let me try to speak up here. It might be a little bit messy in the beginning. So be patient with yourself and do the best you can. But don't feel like speaking up is, it's haram, or the best thing you can always do is stay silent. Yes, sometimes staying silent is the best thing to do. And when you are connected with Allah and when you have knowledge of the deen, you will know in the moment that this is a time where I should stay silent, and usually silence is the best option. But then also you will know, no, this is a time where I need to say something. This is a time where I need to speak up. So may Allah guide us in that. May He guide us in, how to stand up for what is right, how to stand up for ourselves and those we love, and to do it in a way that's pleasing to Him, because it is not always easy. Thank you so much. Subhanaka wa bihamdik. Ashhadu an la ilaha illa ant. Astaghfiruka wa atubu ilaik. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.